everybody, and in fact, good evening to a few people out there. Today's session is called Best Practices in Chemical Management. We'll try to keep this to about 45 minutes today, although we do like to talk. We'll leave some time for Q&A at the end of the session. And if you do have a question, what you can do is you can type your question. You should see a questions box on the control panel for GoToWebinar. If you type in your question, we'll accumulate those throughout the session today, and then we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the session. You do have the option to minimize your control panel. You should see an orange rectangle with a white arrow in it. If you click that, that will minimize the control panel, and you can see the full screen of the presentation. So today we have two guest speakers to spend some time with us today. We first have Scott Williams. Scott Williams is the Director of Sales for SiteHawk and has over 20 years of experience in the EH&S consulting and management field. He's got a background in environmental and safety consulting, and his role is to advise companies in the evaluation and selection of electronic chemical data management systems. We also have Carrie Lynn Jacobs, and Carrie Lynn is the owner and chief consultant for Compliance Optimizers. Compliance Optimizers provides tools and insight to make viable business decisions relating to chemical management and chemical compliance. She's spent the last 17 years in safety-related fields, initiating safety programs for clients, as well as developing applications for OSHA compliance, risk assessment, hazard communication, training, and programs. So with that, let me hand it over to Scott, and we'll start the session.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Craig, and thanks, Carrie Lynn, for getting together with us to talk about best practices in chemical management today. As Craig said, we appreciate everyone taking time. Our goal today is to leave you guys with some information, including the why, the goals of best practices in chemical management, some of the factors, techniques, and tools that you should consider when implementing best practices on chemical management at your facilities. Look at a couple case studies that show direct ROI for companies that you'll know the name and probably have done business with at some point. Leave you with an action plan and a blueprint for steps to take to implement best practices in chemical management. And as Craig said, we'll wrap up with some questions and answers. Carrie Lynn and I both like to hear ourselves speak, so we're going to try to get through this within the time allotted and hopefully provide you guys with some valuable information on what we see is going on in the world today related to chemical management. And the reason that we're doing this in reality is because today's EH&S professionals are clearly faced with more work than with time, with more responsibilities than with hands, and generally more risk than reward, or so it appears a lot of times. We hear a lot about chemical management. We hear a lot about reducing risk. We're hearing a lot now about sustainability. But what are the best practices that you can use, and why should you implement those is the reason that we're here and talking today. Before we do that, I want to take just a minute and talk about chemical management evolution, the history behind best practices in chemical management. And as we look back, generally it started with safety compliance. The approaches often range from a simplistic approach, including hazard communication, to all the way to a more sophisticated approach that may include a regulatory dashboard filled with key performance indicators and metrics. Initially, chemical management was reactive. It was a cost of doing business as related to environmental health and safety compliance. But in reality, in today's world, it should be proactive. It should include a strategy that eliminates risk and improves safety and boosts the bottom line. And one of the things that we always suggest asking yourself is, are you more worried about a potential OSHA audit or an EPA audit, or the impact of your chemical use now and in the future, maybe 20 years from now? And also, how can a best practice give your company a competitive advantage in today's world? With the economy, the state of the economy and the state of competition, anything you can do to differentiate yourself from your competitors is of value.
Definitely, I definitely agree. I'm going to chime in here just a little bit, Scott. Good morning, everyone. It is morning for me. I just wanted to kind of sum up evolution as I see it. Basically, Every step in the evolution provides opportunities for missteps, as we all know. But each step also offers us the opportunity for economic gain as a business, as a company, environmental protection, and to significantly improve workplace safety, reduce workplace accidents and illnesses, as well as minimize the severity of those that might occur. We all know that because of the economy, as you said, a lot of things are down, including workplace accidents and incidents, but that's because a lot less people are working right now. So it's still a main focus. This is still a huge focus for sustainability, risk mitigation, and a competitive advantage by working on best practices.
So with that said, that will take us right into the first part of our discussion on the goals or the considerations, the why we suggest implementing best practices specifically related to chemical management. There are 5 areas that we're going to talk about today. Those areas are safety considerations, regulatory compliance, cost and risk reduction, sustainability initiatives, and understanding your chemical hazard footprint, and finally, a global competitive advantage. Often in today's world, we get pressure from customers, and we hear more and more about top-line reasons for implementing best practices specifically related to chemical and chemical data management.
And to further look at these considerations, I kind of want to take a look at a few statistics on the next slide to help all of us understand what kind of drives these considerations. One of the things that we do look at, of course, are chemicals and the chemical products and how they are causing or what they are causing our employees as far as injuries and illnesses. And you'll see on this slide, we have the 2008 statistics here. I'm not going to read those verbatim for you, but essentially they're saying there were over 15,000 non-fatal occupational injuries and illnesses as it related to chemicals or chemical products or exposures. In 2008, chemicals and chemical products were the source of injury and non-fatal occupational injuries resulting in days away from work by quite a bit. Now that has lowered over the course of the last year. It's lowered by about 5%. However, the number of employees have lowered, as I just mentioned before, so this is still kind of even across the board. When you look back at 2007, workers suffered more than 55,000 illnesses from chemical exposures and nearly 17,000 chemical-related injuries and illnesses, spending time away from work as a result. These numbers are likely an underestimate because many times the effects of those chemical exposures aren't recognized until years after an exposure has occurred. Also looking forward into 2009, the product of chemicals or chemical products attributed to more than 60,000 illnesses. So as you can see, it's gone up, and it continues to go up, and this doesn't include injuries. In 2009, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics attributed 390 fatalities to exposure to harmful substances or environments. And even though we're down in the number of fatalities as a whole from 2008, we've actually increased 5% in fatalities just due to exposures. So we're hoping with these statistics to measure safety progress and determine patterns of injury will guide further improvements in chemical safety. If we spend time recognizing such factors as what chemicals most frequently cause injury, it can help focus on safety or environmental efforts regarding that chemical. Factors such as what part of the body is most commonly affected by particular chemicals. These things can lead to improved personal protection practices, better PPE, thereby benefiting our employees' safety and the safety and health of the environments our businesses are located in. Accessing this information, of course, electronically seems to be becoming the trend, and I personally believe it can be partially noted for the reduction in these exposures by expanding on the ways we educate our people.
So it's clear from the statistics that Carolyn just gave us that safety considerations are one of the primary reasons, one of several for implementing best practices for chemical management in the workplace. Another one that we would talk about are regulatory drivers. On this screen, you'll see a number of regulatory lists, both North American, global, European Union, Asia Pacific, different regulations from different parts of the world, which is interesting that in today's economy and in today's world, these regulations are impactful whether you are located or doing business in that area as well. Quite often in our business, we'll have customers who will contact us about data related to the chemicals we manage for them, specifically to answer a question for their customer. Does any of the raw materials going into my product reside on the SVHC list, the Substance of Very High Concern list from the EU, or is your material REACH compliant? There are a wide range of regulations, and you'll notice in North America things like California Green Chemistry or the Toxic Substance Control Act reform, TSCA reform, which while it hasn't passed yet, if it does, to all indications, this will be more far-reaching than REACH, be very impactful to industry today.
And of course, this is just a small sample of some of the regulatory drivers for best practices. Many of us, specifically in the industries, currently might be affected by multiple regulatory bodies. So it may not just be just the North American group. It could be we're affected by both global, North American, local, what happens with state, federal, and how they interpret these particular governmental regulations. So you could be exposed to a combination of all the above regulatory requirements, and therefore driving us further into the need for best practices.
So understanding the regulations that impact your products or your compliance is an important part of consideration when you're looking at chemical management best practices. One of the regulations that I didn't mention that may be on the tip of everyone's tongue right now, if it's not, it should be, is the Globally Harmonized System, the GHS. Now, on this slide, you'll notice some statistics. This comes directly from OSHA. The Globally Harmonized System is coming, and we'll talk about that a little more in depth over the next couple slides, because there's some specific key factors that I think it's important to address in this conference, this discussion, related to the changes coming to HAZCOM and the timeline. So on the screen, you'll notice that there are 1 million chemicals that OSHA states will be impacted by GHS, more than 5 million businesses and more than 40 million workers. The goal of GHS and the changes to HAZCOM is to make the workplace safer, which is OSHA's mission. They estimate a savings as well of $764 million in the U.S. alone from risk reduction and productivity improvements. And we'll talk specifically about the changes and how that may impact each of us in the very near future. Carrie Lynn, did you want to talk on GHS briefly before I go into this slide, or do you want to wait till I finish this next slide?
I can kind of give you an overview of what I was thinking about as far as the GHS versus HCS. Really, when looking at GHS from a best practices perspective, it's important to point out that these 4 key elements of change are our primary focus initiatives for best practices as well. And Scott's going to go into each one in detail, but whether it be the MSDS as the first step in identification and education to labeling for usage, storage, dangers, responsibilities to communication, both in distributing the knowledge on the hazards and in training employees and management on recognizing, reporting, and changing the ways we deal with these chemicals at our locations. The primary goal for us as an end user and for GHS to us is to increase the quality and consistency of the information provided to our downstream users by adopting a standardized approach to a hazardous classification, standardizing the labels, standardizing the safety data. In the end, the tangible benefits include fewer chemical accidents, safer work environments, increases in efficiency, improved protection of our workers and the public from chemical hazards by streamlining the communications on chemical hazards and practices, and greater awareness, all very important and relevant factors in the quality of life of us as workers and companies and the public at large.
GHS and standardization are 2 terms that get used constantly. The 4 elements that we're talking about that we'll see the most significant change in the current HAZCOM standard are the material safety data sheets, labeling, communication, and training. The MSDS will actually have a new name. It will be an SDS. GHS incorporates rules, specific rules for defining the classifications and the content and the format of a safety data sheet. So not only will a safety data sheet have a new name, it will have new pictograms, it will have new section changes where the old ANSI section, Section 2, was the component section. That will now be Section 3. Section 2 will incorporate the hazard identification information, including those pictograms. All safety data sheets will have to be reauthored, which means that all materials will have to be reclassified according to the new rules associated with GHS that OSHA's HAZCOM is adopting. Labeling will change. There are required elements on labels. In the past, most companies have used NFPA or HMIS workplace labels. So not only will product labels change, but workplace labels will have to accurately reflect the hazards associated with the use of those chemicals, which means that workplace labels will need GHS pictograms. They'll need signal words. They'll need hazard and precautionary statements, and those have to be co-located on the safety data sheet. One of the big challenges that industry is going to face, and we're hoping to get feedback from both NFPA and HMIS in the near future, is that in GHS, the 1 rating or classification is the most hazardous. NFPA and HMIS, a 1 rating is the least hazardous. So it's possible that you could see a label that has a GHS rating of 1 and an HMIS rating of 4, which could create significant confusion in the workplace. That leads us to communication, one of the other primary changes in GHS. All of those safety data sheets that get updated by law have to be distributed and the hazards communicated downstream. So there will be a large influx of safety data sheet material, paper copies, electronic copies flying throughout the wild to make sure that those hazards are communicated properly to the end user. That also impacts training. Obviously, as new safety data sheets come in or classifications change or label requirements change, employees who use the chemical in their daily activities have to be trained on those new hazard classifications and a way to understand what the hazards are associated with the use of that chemical. What we're hearing, the last that we heard from OSHA was in their fall agenda, and they confirmed that in a public discussion in the last 60 days, was their goal is to publish the final rule for HAZCOM changes in August of this year. That means, based on the current proposed rule, that we'll have 2 years from that date to train our employees on the changes to GHS and 3 years to fully implement and transition from the current HAZCOM standard to the new HAZCOM standard, which incorporates the elements of GHS. So one of the best management practices that I can suggest is to incorporate a system to understand and transition to GHS and to manage the new requirements that are associated with the new HAZCOM standard.
I completely agree in that regard. We are going to be, over the next couple of years, as business units, in a constant state of change. Even though GHS will be implemented, when it does get implemented, hopefully at the end of this year, it's still going to have minor modifications happening to it over the course of the next 10 years, which means that constant state of communication, the constant state of training is going to be a necessary element in creating a best practices that's going to effectively make change in the way that we manage our chemicals on site.
Yeah, we probably could spend a whole, in fact, we have spent whole webinars talking about GHS and ways to transition. Let's move on to another good reason or goal or why that we would suggest implementing best management practices in chemical management, and that is simply ROI, return on investment. Some of the simple areas to consider when looking at return on investment are elimination of chemical document administration costs. Consider outsourcing to an electronic safety data sheet management company. They're more efficient and more accurate and have more time on their hands to do those things. It's what we do. The upcoming GHS changes are going to result in a large influx of new and updated safety data sheets, and using an outsourced provider will definitely provide a return on investment. You can lower insurance premiums or out-of-pocket workers' compensation claims by managing the hazards in the workplace. There are absolutely reduced costs associated with reduced incident ratings. Vendor consolidation. Consider reducing the number of vendors providing acetone to your facilities. Lower chemical inventory counts by understanding what chemicals are located where in the facility and ordering as needed in a just-in-time approach. And of course, risk reduction. It's hard to put a firm number on risk reduction, but many people can by looking at the reduction in fines, the reduction in frequency of employee incidents, and even the severity of those incidents because of an understanding of the hazards in the workplace.
You know, I just wanted to kind of chime in here on that frequency of incidents and risk reduction and fines as well, and I have a couple of more things to say about the ROI too, but as far as OSHA goes, just this year in 2010, OSHA found over 96,000 violations just in the OSHA standards, and of those 96,000, about 130 or 140 of those fines to those businesses were over $100,000 fines each. So this is definitely not a small investment as it relates to risk reduction. This is definitely something that you want to take a look at as a return on investment, managing those chemicals, managing your HAZCOM compliance. Very important. But really, what it all boils down to for me as an end user, and I can only talk about how our customers use the system and what we do for our customers, but what's important for best practices is what's it going to cost me? One of the things that I ask my customers when I walk into their facilities to do chemical audits is, boy, how much do you think that MSDS binder that's sitting on that table over there that you call a binder station or an MSDS station, how much do you think that thing is costing you every year? And you'd be surprised at the answers I get. Some people have no idea what it would cost them because they just expect that it gets done or think that it gets done. In reality, it's not. The truth is about you could say one 3 or 4 inch binder, it'll have maybe 300 or 400 MSDSs in it. It can cost a company over $4,000 a year if it's kept up properly. Now, a few years back, it's been probably 5 or 6 years, maybe a little bit longer, we did a study, or our company did a study with multiple different types of companies, industries, large and small, to determine what it costs to keep just a basic form of chemical awareness. And by awareness, I mean the MSDS. And on an average, it was about $4,100 a year. So some people, it costs a whole lot more to manage those 300 or 400 MSDSs. Now think about that number when you think about how many stations of MSDSs you have in your facilities. That number can turn into a huge dollar amount depending on the size of your business units, depending on your local regulations, whether you have LEPC rules on where you can store those MSDSs. How many different sets you have to have in order to make them readily accessible. Doesn't include training on the chemicals themselves, just the maintenance. Doesn't include the fines or accidents or illnesses or injuries incurred if the right information isn't in the books. So the question I ask is, can I maximize my return on investment by incorporating people, process, and technology to create a best practice that minimizes or eliminates that cost? The answer for me and for our customers is yes.
Absolutely. There's no question about that, Carrie Lynn. I continue to be pleasantly surprised at the ROI that we see when companies implement best practices. So you mentioned people, process, and technology. I want to move to the next of the fourth of 5 goals or considerations when we're looking at best practices, and that is sustainability and understanding your chemical hazard footprint. You know, the definition of chemical hazard footprint is really the mark that we leave behind by choices we make regarding chemicals or other hazardous substances. The measure of the amount, toxicity, use, and management of substances throughout an organization. It is impacted or impactful in regulatory, physical end of things related to the exposures of chemicals and, of course, the environment, how your use of the chemicals downstream can impact both your local environment and the environment where your products end up. So when you're looking at a hazard footprint, your corporate or your facility as a whole could have certain hazards associated with them. You may want to view those hazards by job, by employee, by chemical area, by the plant as a whole, by your corporation as a whole, or even by hazard type or by material. And there's some specific goals associated with reducing your chemical hazard footprint. One is to reduce the number, volume, and use of hazardous chemicals. When looking at best practices, these are things I would consider when putting together a plan. Identify potential product substitutions for your most hazardous chemicals. Better communicate the considerations and the impacts of working with hazardous chemicals, basically increasing your worker safety. Of course, you want to meet your regulatory compliance and your stakeholder initiatives. You want to reduce corporate and facility risk, and you want to reduce overall costs of EHS programs and long-term remediation associated with the use of chemicals. Sustainability is becoming not a buzzword, but a requirement in today's competitive world. And understanding your hazard footprint, understanding the chemicals and the hazards associated with maybe the materials being used in your research for creating new products, so that you don't go down a path where you've created a product and realize it can't be sold in California because it contains a component that is on Prop 65, for example. You may have spent tens of thousands or tens of millions of dollars creating a product that's unsellable in part of the world. So understanding that hazard footprint and understanding it as early in the process as you can is an important consideration when talking about the whys for best management practices.
And that brings us into competitive advantage, especially when you're looking at sustainability and your hazard footprint. The competitive advantage is something that every business needs to have their feet dipped into, essentially. And there are 4 questions that we generally ask as it relates to competitive advantage. The first one is, do your customers have sustainability requirements? Is energy efficiency important? What about safety? What about clean internal combustions and effective end-of-life options for the products you manufacture or the products you purchase? Do you require certificates of guarantee for the products you use, or do your vendors require them for the products they provide? These are all important questions to think about when you're determining your best practices and how to generate a competitive advantage. The second one, are you meeting global regulations for shipping and using hazardous chemicals? This includes labeling requirements. Local, state, federal, TSCA, REACH, GHS, are there internal initiatives for hazardous chemicals? You need to make sure that these are important. Does your chemical strategy protocol support lean initiatives? Are you maximizing the use of your employees' time and increasing the quality and value of their output? Are you able to efficiently satisfy environmental reporting and risk monitoring initiatives? Are your reports done based on estimates, or are they based on previous year's data versus the real-time data and usage? I know, being in this industry for this long, I could say that's probably a 60-40 split based on estimates and real-time data. Is your reporting done at the facility level or a corporate level? Are they done at both? These are all important questions to get answers to when you want to effect a competitive advantage. Answers to these questions will not only provide a solid foundation for a best practices in chemical management, they'll provide you, as a company or business unit, the competitive advantage. Each of these questions roll us into the next slide, which is factors to consider, especially in best practices. There are 3 factors to consider in developing and implementing a best practice approach to chemical management. In my opinion, it's people, process, and technology. When we're talking about best practices, there are really 3 main factors. Within the people, process, and technology, in the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about the people mostly, because really our people are the most important part of best practice methodology. As you can see by the diagram here, each factor is important, and each factor overlaps the other on every aspect. Without the people, you wouldn't need the process or the technology, and so on. So moving towards the people, moving into who we have, let's talk about the people. This is truly my company's main focal point when putting together best practice initiatives. The question to ask is how to get each of these groups to collaborate. And I know everybody's scratching their head right now. We want them to form processes and implement technologies that will work for each of their business units and still work together. Some companies may only have safety managers and an IT person. Some might not even have an IT person. Maybe they don't have any local IT support. Maybe they only have environmental health and safety, or EHS and risk are one person at your facility. Regardless of the circumstance, the job still has to get done. So let's talk about what some of these roles are. Safety, environmental, and risk managers wear so many hats in the industries these days. As I mentioned, many times these roles are defined and implemented by one person at a facility level or group at a corporate level, or by a company like me that is that center point that facilitates the management of your chemicals for all the facilities and corporate. Responsibilities include creating hazardous communication plans, environmental and regulatory reports, compliance tracking, all of which could be streamlined by developing processes that implement technology. Again, it's that people, process, and technology. It's important that these people and groups are provided the tools and the upper management support to enhance the corporate image of responsibility and safety. It's inevitable. Automating these tasks that are normally done by hand, such as chemical inventories, if you've ever done one, you understand what I'm saying there. Approval processes, chemical approval processes. I have 140 some odd facilities that have paper approval processes that we're converting into electronic format just because tracking it has been a nightmare. Waste tracking, usage and risk factors can be streamlined by modernizing our processes. By engaging our people and integrating and updating our current processes with technology, I believe we can conserve much of our needed human resources for more value-added tasks like increasing operational safety or increasing environmental compliance or decreasing the legal liabilities and improving the way chemicals flow in and out of our business units. Again, procurement as well, along with the industrial hygienists, provide opportunities to analyze chemicals before the material is even purchased. They provide inventory visibility and allow for purchasing controls to be put in place to minimize costs associated with purchasing these chemicals. Allowing the visibility from both a corporate and facility level in an effort to minimize chemical purchases to only the amounts required, reduce the inventory, and store only what is necessary in the near term. IT provides the security and support to integrate these departments in such a way that can directly benefit your bottom line with the use of technology. So each one of these groups, and there may be more groups at your particular business units, but each one of these groups in one way or another overlaps the other. Risk somehow manages to fall into safety, as well as safety needs the help of IT and procurement. Procurement can help to consolidate vendors, to consolidate purchases, saving you money based on group purchases, which then saves time and effort on the safety manager's side for what they have to manage as far as MSDSs or chemical-related situations. So definitely a way of maintaining track. The people are very important in the three key elements for people, process, and technology. So from there, we move into the chemical management processes, and I believe that Scott's going to go into the 5 stages of a chemical management process, and I'll chime in as well.
Yeah, one thing I realized, Carrie Lynn, I thought this might be the case. We're starting to press up against our time. We're at 30 minutes in, so I'm probably going to speed through these just a little bit more than we normally would. Imagine that. So as Carrie Lynn mentioned, there are 5 main areas or techniques that we think best practices can be most effective in chemical management, and those are chemical inventory management, material approval, chemical data management, monitoring and reporting, and communication and training. So I'm going to start with chemical inventory management, and what I'd like to do is just talk about the elements, the specific elements, of a proper inventory management best practice. Understanding what chemicals, where they're located, and how much of those chemicals is the basic standard element of a chemical inventory management best practice. There are a couple of different ways of measuring those. One is by doing a physical chemical inventory. The other is by looking at a procurement-based inventory. In other words, what's purchased. The elements you have to consider there are the situation where a P card is available, or a maintenance worker can buy something from a local hardware store. So understanding the chemicals and then not only understanding the proper elements initially, but managing ongoing inventories, having access to data from updated safety data sheets where classifications may change or PPE may change, potentially looking at barcoding so that you can quickly and efficiently do a more current inventory and compare that to the hazard data associated with a particular area in your facility. Using data exchange between your purchasing system, between a regulatory content database, and between a safety data sheet system, or one provider that incorporates all of those elements will allow you to have effective best practices for chemical inventory management.
Really, and also the MSDS is essentially the foundation to build a proper inventory management system. Along with the supporting documentation, the MSDS is the key to understanding what our people are exposed to on a daily basis and what the risks are both near and long term. The information it contains also provides a snapshot for trending, opportunities for green initiatives, to keep the competitive advantage, back to that competitive advantage. And the truth is, we have to have them. We have to keep them for what may seem like forever to most of us. And we have to keep them current to support the health and well-being of our employees and our business units. It's really time to redefine our inventories and set the standards across our organizations and set them high. Without hesitation, I can say I believe initiating proper inventory management could be the difference between life and death in some instances for our employees.
I agree completely, Carrie Lynn, and what that does is it really segues me to the next element or area that we consider a good, effective place for best practices, and that is material approval. Controlling those materials as they come into a facility. We talked a little bit about that, but what are some of the basic elements of an effective material approval process? Well, one is including the appropriate personnel in the review cycle. If regulatory, environmental engineer needs to review, as well as quality and human resources or safety, all of those people need to be included in the review process to ensure that the material is accurately, the hazards of the material are accurately assessed prior to the material being brought into the facility. Ensuring that the material approval process is trackable, having some means of understanding who has not signed off on it, and following up in the future to understand how the material is assessed. And then, of course, it has to be modified easily as the work environment or personnel changes. Someone gets promoted or takes a new opportunity. That doesn't mean that material approvals can't happen. The system has to allow for those modifications to the work environment. Processes may change. And finally, it has to be a closed loop. What that means is that the requester has to be notified it's okay to purchase. There are even material approval systems out there that will notify procurement that it's been approved by the approval review team, and even notify the data management company that's managing your safety data sheets that it is now needs to be added into the database and all the hazards accurately indexed so you can then measure your key performance indicators for hazard footprint reduction. We also suggest in material approval that you go beyond that, that you utilize some of the data and part of the approval process to consider hazard profiling. For example, setting a predetermined list of hazards, carcinogens, for example, or mutagenic effects, or highly toxic, or they're regulated in certain regulatory lists that are important to your industry, and using a tool that will allow you to make those assessments quickly and efficiently as opposed to going through a safety data sheet that may be 15 pages long with the new changes related to GHS. Go beyond and include chemical and risk assessment. Understand the risk associated with the use of that in the workplace as it relates to the other chemicals found in that workplace, or simply understanding the risk used associated with that material based on the amount of use. So, for example, the exposure limits.
Now, I couldn't have said that any better myself, actually.
Thanks, Carrie Lynn.
Yes, all of those questions and all of those topics are bound to end up in the what do we do with all of this information fishbowl, and it brings us into the chemical data management part of best practices. Now, the MSDS, as I said before, it really is the foundation. But these are questions that you need to ask yourself for your company. What data is important? The MSDS might be the foundation, but what are you tracking? Are you tracking technical data? Are you tracking specifications, nutritional data, hazard trends, some of the things that he mentioned in the previous slide? What kind of chemicals are you dealing with? You have to know what the chemicals that you're dealing with are. You have to be proactive. You have to be out there. Those on-site chemical inventories, they need to be done annually, if not semi-annually. Most are required to do annually, but get done once every 10 years. It's important to stay on top of those and be proactive. What kind of reporting is required? Is it state, local, federal, industry-specific? Are you required to report to a specific agency locally that your other facility in Minnesota may not be? Every industry has their own data needs, per se. If you're producing food versus oil, you have different reporting needs. If you have a high volume of product that could create dust explosion hazards, which we deal with on a regular basis, you may have different tracking needs. That's an industry that builds equipment versus an industry that builds equipment or creates something else. Know your industry and know what your company's needs are. Those are the key in creating or finding a chemical data management process that will work best for you as far as best practices go. And it takes us into, again, the MSDS being that foundational element.
Yeah, I want to add, I think I've heard people say MSDS, and I'll add to that that a good MSDS is a foundational element. We hope that GHS will help that by standardizing format and content. And I'm not going to take much time here except to remind everyone that on the safety data sheet you'll find hazard classifications, regulatory information, including the components and their weight percent. Don't forget to look at section 15 on a safety data sheet because there may be regulatory information that wasn't found in the component section or components found in the component section that aren't listed in the regulatory section. Exposure limits, handling, storage, PPE, there's a lot. A firm belief I have is that the MSDS will help you and anyone meet their training, compliance, and reporting goals.
Absolutely. And again, that drives us right back into best practice benefits of chemical management. And you can see the bullet points here with MSDS data indexing and the complete indexing of that data, having the ability to access and cross-reference health and physical hazards for our employees, being able to determine physical and chemical classifications on the fly for classification-specific training, for those of us that have to do that, and there are many of us. Transportation classifications, also an important aspect of the hazard plan, and training of your employees. Being able to cross-reference our chemicals with local, state, and federal regulatory lists, as well as unique company-defined lists. For us specifically, or for my customers specifically, many of them have their own banned chemical lists of chemicals that we cannot use on site due to what we're dealing with in the manufacturing process. Secondary labeling, that it's consistent for all users, pre-populated with information that's necessary for the safety of their employees. A material approval process that starts at the user, starts at the employee level, and it's easy to understand and track. Generating regulatory reports and tracking substances, we've kind of harped on that over and over through the course of this webinar as part of best practices. It's very important. And again, having GHS compliant data. These are all part of implementing a best practice. That moves us into monitoring and reporting, and I'm trying to speed us up a little bit. I know that we promised about 45 minutes, so I'm going to let Scott take over on the monitoring and reporting.
Okay, so again, one of the techniques or areas that we want to suggest that everyone looks at when they're implementing best practices is on monitoring and reporting. And the first step there we recommend is to set goals to remove specific hazard types. Look and understand what carcinogens or corrosives or toxic substances are found in your facility. Set key performance indicators, metrics, and then reduce that. Sustainability, green environment, continuous improvement are all part of our world today. The second part of that is identifying certain high-risk plants or chemical areas or job functions. Look at it from a holistic approach by area or by job or within the facility as a whole in your organization. And then 3, determine the regulatory impact of those materials when reviewing a hazard footprint. For example, California's Prop 65. And then finally, identify alternative products that have a lower hazardous footprint, something that's equally of use in your process, but that may not have the same hazard impact as others. We suggest a proactive approach here. By understanding and having your hands around the hazards and the data associated with the chemicals you plan to use, as well as those you use in your facility, you can absolutely integrate those initial goals, ROI, for example, or sustainability. And the last area I think Carrie Lynn will talk about is communication and training.
Right, and these are the questions that I believe firmly that you should start with when developing your own best practices. What's required? Ask yourself what's required in your industry. If you're new to the industry, look to industry partners or professionals like myself or SiteHawk or any industry professional that could help you learn more about what's required as far as reporting goes and communication and training in your particular industry. How can I help my employees understand the risks and safety procedures in a way that they will not just remember, but they'll implement it and be examples of? How do we get employees and management involved? Well, my answer to this, to everyone, is always get management involved. It's not asking. You have to get them involved. Don't allow management to sit on the sidelines. Employees will want to be involved if it isn't something they feel only applies to them. What initiatives do I have in place for employees to be a part of? Management is management. Employees are employees. However, neither could be one without the other. So I really believe, I firmly believe, the team approach is often, if not always, the best start.
And Carrie Lynn, I'm going to add in here, related to getting management involved. I think it's important to understand that if you can provide return on investment information or key performance indicators or show continuous improvement and reduced costs and reduced risk, as well as a competitive advantage, then that's going to allow you to have management on your side. And I'm going to take, I know we're running late, but I want to take 2 seconds to talk about a customer that we do business with that really is taking the data and the services for managing chemical data, safety data sheets, and the hazards associated with them, and using that as a competitive advantage and actually increasing their market share as a direct result, because it differentiates them from their competitors, and they provide management services to their companies and to their clients, and that is a real success story related directly to getting management involved, understanding the value to chemical management best practices, and then using that to increase your market share.
Absolutely. And lastly, what are the expectations and where do we go from here? This takes us to the 3 main factors to consider for best practice, or the last of the 3 main factors anyway, and that's technology. Now, technology and tools, electronic versus manual MSDS management, boy, I have my own opinion on this, and we could have a whole webinar on that. But as important as the people are, so is the technology and the tools that we have at our disposal in today's EHS environment. Before you start looking at your options as part of your best practices, you really need to sit down and define your needs, whether it be you as a group or you as an individual, to start the process. Put together a team and identify resources specifically to collaborate on. What best fits your business environment? Create a checklist. When weighing the options between electronic compliance versus manual, talk to the experts. Someone like me that's been around the compliance industry that knows the ins and outs of electronic compliance and the pros and cons of them and how they could or may not fit your needs. We have all been in the trenches with maintaining hard copy binders, generating manual reports, and I still do for many of my customers that are moving to electronic compliance, thankfully, and can provide insight on what processes you can implement to modernize your record keeping. We can really help You put together a technology budget, determine your company or employees' risk factors, and then set your expectations before you take the next step. As an example, one of my current customers, which happens to be the world's largest meat producer, we manage, or my company manages their chemical inventory from a corporate and facility-based perspective. So we have over 50 complexes with 200 plus facilities located at these complexes, and they made the decision to move into electronic compliance arena. It's been several years ago, probably 10 years ago, to get a handle on the more than 25,000 documents and chemicals that they thought they had on site at the time. And it turns out, after they spent tons and tons and tons of money on a system they bought into back then as an initiative to save time and money, it turns out that those 25,000 documents, most of that was junk. About 20,000 of it was junk. There were only maybe 5,000 actual chemicals being used, maybe just over 5,000. We were able to go from a system that boasted chemical compliance because we needed to move into the electronic compliance age, but didn't handle us as a customer, to a new vendor, which happens to be SiteHawk at this time, that has taken us from 25,000 documents that were junk to 5,000 documents that are a reflection of our real-time inventory. So we know now what our facilities and what our complexes are currently using. We're able to maintain them and keep them up to date. We are implementing workflow processes at a facility level and at a corporate level, depending on the workflow structure for a particular type of chemical. Each has their own type of approval process. We've implemented electronic reporting, so now instead of shuffling around in January trying to get ready for Tier 2s, we actually follow electronically the usage by importing our SAP data into the SiteHawk system, actually. So getting a corporate view and having access to the data on a corporate level and at a facility level has completely changed the chemical process for this particular customer. Not only did it give them a competitive advantage, but it also provided them an opportunity to save a ton of money by being able to consolidate vendors. With the buying power that they have, utilizing so many chemicals, we stopped using acetone from 10 different vendors, and we're able to consolidate pricing for 150 to 200 facilities for one particular vendor of that product, saving us a ton in the end. So just wanted to jump in there and say that the technology definitely works for customers out there looking for a solution to get out from underneath the MSDS headache.
You know, Carrie Lynn, that's as great a case study as I've ever heard. I had a couple to go through. I'm gonna talk real briefly about one, skip the other one, and go right to the blueprint because I think we're past time. I do want to talk about the one that you see on the screen, which is Lexmark. It's a similar scenario. They felt they had 12,000 active chemicals in their workplace. By implementing and utilizing some of the best practices and some of the processes that we've talked about today, they reduced that number almost in half to 6,500. They shortened their chemical introduction process from weeks to days. They gained access to site-level data as well as a corporate view to understanding the hazards in the workplace and their chemical hazard footprint. And they eliminated the daily chore of acquiring, updating, and maintaining MSDSs, thus freeing up professionals to manage true environmental health and safety compliance-related issues. So it's absolutely evident that by implementing chemical management best practices, there is a definite ROI that's associated with a lot of world-class companies out there. So to go right into the best practices, I realize that we're running long, and I apologize to everyone for doing that. We hope to have some time for questions, but I want to talk about a blueprint. You know, we've discussed the goals for having best practices, the why. We talked about some factors involved, what to consider, some of the techniques, some of the tools, but I really want to talk briefly about a blueprint, the steps that you take to implement best practices. And this is our 5-step approach to this. I'll talk through the first 3, and then I think Carrie Lynn, if you'll jump in on the last 2, we'll wrap this up.
Sure.
So first of all, get an accurate view of your current chemical inventory through a physical chemical inventory, a procurement-based review if you have a good handle on chemicals coming into the facility, but understand at a current level what chemicals are found in the workplace. The second step would be to gain control of those. Use a material approval process that is incorporated into the processes and procedures of your employee access for purchasing materials that includes the right review team and then is proactive and incorporates all those elements we talked about earlier of an effective chemical approval process. Step 3 is use a system and or service that provides access to the chemical data found on the safety data sheet. Understanding the information that's there that your employees can be exposed to, that your customers may have to deal with in the use of your products is an important part of your best practice process. Understanding how the data gets updated, ensuring that you have access to the most current information, and how you use that information and take advantage of it is an important part of that third step.
And step 4 is realizing the synergy of MSDS data and the systems for integrated material approval, regulatory reporting, labeling, sustainability initiatives, as well as core safety compliance. Really understanding how creating an electronic approval process or being able to initiate electronic regulatory reports on the fly, how the labeling changes that are coming and occurring as we speak are going to affect your initiatives, really are something we need to grab a hold of in this best practices blueprint. And step 5, being able to identify and communicate relevant information to the employees. That is key, not just to your employees, but also to the regulators, to your management, in order to reduce the risk, increase your safety, and gain competitive advantage. Very, very important to be able to translate how you can put your best practices into effect in a way that everyone on the other side of that best practices wall understands and can take in and replicate at a facility level or a corporate level or at a business unit level. Very important as far as best practices go.
So, Carrie Lynn, imagine this. You and I went long. We're almost 15 minutes long, and I want to thank, as much my fault as anyone. So I want to thank everyone for attending and participating. I think Craig will wrap up with some administrative discussion on availability of the webinar. Also, I want to let you know that Carrie Lynn and I are both available as in this industry. We'll be attending the AIHCE next in 2 weeks out in Portland, be it the NSC and ASSE and most of the other national shows out there. If you have questions or there's something that we can support you in from a chemical management process or in the EH&S world, we'd love to talk to you, so feel free to reach out to us.
Great. Great. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Carrie Lynn. We appreciate your time today, and thank you to the audience. We will be sending out a link to the recording. You will get that link within a day or two when we just send out the follow-up emails. And then we will also make the slides available. For any questions that did not get answered during the session, we will follow up with those directly and answer those to the best of our ability. So once again, thank you very much, and have a great day.